China and U.S.-China relations have suddenly appeared on everyone's radar screens. Decades ago, when I started studying Chinese, people would ask me why in the world I was doing so. No one asks me that anymore. China regularly appears on the front pages of newspapers, the covers of magazines, and among the lead stories on the evening broadcasts. Americans want to know more about China and better understand it, and our relations with it. And we could have no one better to talk to us about these issues than Dr. Kurt Campbell, our Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. Kurt, an old friend of the committee's, is intimately involved in American China policy and has recently returned from traveling to China with President Obama. I might add the interesting fact, and I think a telling one, Kurt, that Obama was the first American president to choose to go to China during his first term. And you might want to expand on that a little bit during the Q&A part. But before turning to Kurt, I want to thank all of our partners in the various venues for helping put this program together. Our small but very dedicated National Committee staff has done a terrific job in coordinating this nationwide event. But we couldn't have done it without our venue partners' help. Finally, let me thank Kurt Campbell. You all have his bio, so I won't take time to list his accomplishments, which are many and impressive. But I will say, from having traveled to Asia with Kurt on several occasions, participating in many meetings and track 2 dialogues with him, that you're in for a real treat. After Kurt's remarks, I will be asking him questions that you email to us from around the country. We encourage you to submit your questions even during his talk, so that we will have some in the queue as soon as he's done. We'll try to get to all of them, but I want to apologize in advance to those whose questions we don't have a chance to answer. And now, Kurt, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Jan. It's really an honor to be with you today. And let me just say that few people over the course of the last 20 years have done more to contribute to a stronger relationship between the United States and China than Jan.
My mother will thank you for that.
And I've been the beneficiary of many of these dialogues and meetings, and her dedication is known throughout the entire circle of people that think about U.S.-China relations. It's an honor to be with you today. Let me just begin with some overarching themes, and frankly, I'm looking very much forward to answering questions and hopefully interacting with the audience in terms of things that are of concern to Americans outside of Washington, D.C. First of all, let me begin by suggesting an important dimension of this administration. If you look back over the course of the last 100 years, I think it'd be fair to say that most of the presidents who were elected, to the extent that they had any international experience, and most of our presidents have been primarily domestically oriented in terms of their experience and their focus. To the extent that there was international engagement, it was primarily in Europe and in Latin America, and you see that with Woodrow Wilson and Presidents Roosevelt, with John Kennedy and others. In many respects, President Obama, among many of his characteristics that are unique, one is, of course, in many respects, he is the first Asian Pacific president, in the sense that he was raised in Hawaii and spent an enormous amount of time at a young age traveling through Indonesia, parts of Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. I've had a chance to spend quite a bit of time with him, and he has a feel for Asia and a knowledge that, frankly, I found a little intimidating in my initial interactions with him. His knowledge about intricacies of village life in the Philippines, or certain declensions in the Indonesian national language, I was shocked by. But in fact, it's very much to our great advantage in terms of those of the people who are interested in the promotion of strong U.S. relations with Asia as a whole. The president came in with his senior advisors believing that there was a perception in Asia and also in China that the United States had been a little bit preoccupied away from the drama that was playing out in the Asia-Pacific region, and that we were more focused on important, though not Asia-focused issues like Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq. And the president was determined that his Secretary of State, his key players in the cabinet, would focus an enormous amount of time during its first year in office on these issues in the Asia-Pacific region, and not limit ourselves simply to economic issues, but a broad range of questions that confront the United States today. Our first goal has been to send a message that the United States is fully engaged and that we are a resident power and player in the politics of the Asian-Pacific region. We saw over the course of the last several months Secretary Clinton visit Asia 3 times, and she convened the first ever China strategic dialogue between the United States and senior leaders in the foreign ministry. President Obama chose during the first several months of his administration to make a major visit to Asia at a time where there were pressing decisions to be made on Afghanistan and on healthcare, to send a message of how important these questions and issues are. The centerpiece in many respects of this trip was our re-engagement with our allies, Japan and South Korea, our commitment to economic issues, the free trade agreement with South Korea, a new negotiation on a free trade agreement of a larger group of nations in Southeast Asia, a new commitment to a broader dialogue in Southeast Asia, but also, and perhaps most importantly, a visit to China, where the president spent 3 days, both a visit to Shanghai and Beijing. I think it is now commonplace and well understood that one of the most consequential bilateral relations that the United States will engage in the 21st century is the one between the United States and China, and that is now undeniable. It is the case that almost every major issue confronting the United States, whether it be climate change, proliferation, poverty, energy insecurity, all of these issues cannot be addressed adequately without a stronger base of cooperation between the United States and China. The preparation for the president's trip was enormous behind the scenes, and what we found was a deep and broad dialogue, but a dialogue that reflects the changing nature of U.S.-China relations. The truth is that the United States has had few relationships historically that will prepare us adequately for the complexities of the U.S.-China relations. We've had a relationship, obviously, with a country like Great Britain, close, harmonious, generally see most issues eye to eye. And for 50 years, we had a relationship with a country like the Soviet Union, highly conflictual, enormous tension, deep uncertainty. The relationship with China is going to be very different. It's going to embody areas of deep and indeed profound cooperation, but it will also have areas of misunderstanding, of competition, and uncertainty. And it's the combination of these issues that is going to pose the greatest challenge, not just to American leaders, but the understanding of the American people. Every major consequential issue, like economic issues, trade issues, questions of human rights, democratization, countries seeking to develop nuclear weapons in North Korea and in Iran, all of these issues are now central to the conduct of U.S.-China relations. And the president's visit to China reflected this fullness and the drama, in a sense, that is currently playing out between Beijing and Washington. In our deliberations between the two sides, there was a broad discussion about the need to rebalance our relationship on an economic basis, that the United States would need to save more going forward. And indeed, China, for us to have a more sustainable economic relationship, would need to develop a middle class more, would need to think of the United States not as the only export market, but need to restructure its economy to deal with the complexities of the global financial situation. We dealt with regional issues like Iran and North Korea. We talked about the challenges of poverty. You will see from our joint statement a deep and full set of issues that we're working together, reflecting a deepening and broadening relationship. I think it's also the case that we met at a time on the outskirts, if you will, of one of the most consequential negotiations in history on the climate change negotiations that are underway now in Copenhagen, and the president and his Chinese counterparts debated and discussed these issues at a level and an intensity that heretofore has been missing in the overall debate. I think it would be fair to say that we were surprised that some of the criticism that we had domestically on this trip. And I think, one of the things that happens when you're in government, you try not to be defensive to this. You try to listen to the criticism. But I must say that I think some of it was misplaced. The idea that an American president can come to China in the current circumstances and demand fundamental changes and deliverables, I think that doesn't accurately reflect the nature of a much more complicated relationship that is evolving, that's going to take a much higher degree of education on the part of the United States, a deeper patience and commitment, and a recognition that we have no choice but to get this relationship right. Too much is riding on it. Jan.
Okay. Well, you touched actually on a question that I was going to ask you, although I promised to save as much time as possible for our questioners who are coming in from the outside. But I must say that most of the China scholars that I know, in reading that joint statement, which was 6 pages long, very small print, and as you said, shows the depth and the breadth of the relationship, and it's extraordinarily expanded over the years. So given what I would see as a deliverable in terms of that statement, why is it you think that you got such negativity from the American press?
Well, it's an important question. It's one I think it'd be fair to say that we've reflected on extensively. I think there are a variety of reasons. First of all, it got very positive treatment throughout Asia, and I think I and others in the administration have heard similar comments from friends from the expert community and elsewhere about how important the visit was and how the president struck the right tone overall. First of all, I think that the trip happened at a period of the, shall we say, the arc of the president's term in office. I think 8 months ago, generally speaking, the president got extraordinarily positive press. I think it is a natural experience that you go through periods where you perhaps get a bit more public scrutiny and criticism, and I think this trip happened to fall during that period. Lots of pressing issues at home, as we discussed earlier, on healthcare and Afghanistan and the like, and budget issues. And let's face it, the American people, for a variety of reasons, are in a sour mood about the state of the economy and unemployment. And so I think there is a general sense of expectation and some anxiety from the U.S. government. I think a larger problem is our previous experience associated with these meetings, and we call them summits. The truth is that we are going to now meet on a much more regular, much more sustained basis with our Chinese interlocutors. And it is unrealistic to expect major breakthroughs at every meeting. That's just not the way the business, the conduct of our relationship will be any longer. It's going to be much more of a business as usual. A third reason, I think there was some expectation that the Chinese would, on a variety of issues, say, okay, well, you demand these issues, well, here's the answer. I would just offer that that's just not how it's going to be, that the Chinese people feel a new sense that they are rising in global politics. It's not that the United States is declining. We're still the dominant power in global politics, and we will remain so for decades. But the truth is, China expects to deal with the United States in a different way. And so when we cooperate, it will be on their terms and when they think it is in their best interests. And sometimes when they deliver that cooperation, they won't do it in an environment when it appears that they are responding directly to the demands of an American leader.
And are we ready for that? Are we ready for that change?
I think if you look historically, the rise of a great power to a new status almost invariably creates tensions with the existing powers in the global system, whether it be the United States and Britain, Sparta and Athens. History has many examples of the challenges that this process provides. I think that the United States has a very deep and substantial education process that will be necessary, not just about American position in the world economically and politically vis-a-vis China, but at a much broader level to understand what's going on inside Asia and China. And I think that process is beginning. But I do think it's going to involve some pain and some difficulties on both sides, and probably some tensions. And it will be the greatest test of statecraft, I think, in modern history.
Well, speaking of those tensions, let's go to our first question from David Knudy. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Madison, Wisconsin. David asked, what is the greatest threat to U.S.-China relations? Tibet autonomy, Taiwan, protectionism, monetary issues?
I think each and every one of those questions, if mishandled, could pose a challenge to U.S.-China relations. I would add another issue, however, that I think is equally important. If the United States and China, and indeed India and Indonesia and other growing states, cannot effectively come to terms with the challenge of climate change, then we are all in the hottest possible water, not to mix metaphors here. And I think that actually poses one of the greatest challenges to U.S.-China relations, is a recognition of the contribution and the role we play in global climate change, and the necessity to deal with these problems earlier rather than later. I think each of these problems has at their core the prospect of incidents and unintended actions spinning out of control. One of the things that we've seen historically with various crises, like the so-called EP3 incident in the early part of this decade, when a American reconnaissance plane collided with a Chinese fighter, was that the inability to deal initially with the crisis management posed very severe challenges to both countries. And I don't think those mechanisms are well understood or indeed very well utilized between the two countries. And so the problem is not simply the issues themselves, which each standing on their own pose very real problems and that must be managed. But it is also that the United States and China does not have very much experience in dealing with, shall we say, problem management.
Well, following up on that, FTZ9 from Honolulu, I don't know if that's an avatar or your license plate, but he asks how you would characterize U.S.-China cooperation on global issues such as climate change. And I know from reading the joint statement, there was a lot said about that. And then I saw a fascinating C-SPAN rebroadcast of a day-long conference in Washington a couple of weeks ago that had enormously interesting programs that we're cooperating on with
I have to say there are a lot of people that are working hard on this issue. I've been very much informed by Ken Lieberthal's very important work on how China is conceptualizing and thinking about its role in climate change. I think I see some areas of progress. I think there is a broad and deep recognition among the elite in both societies that this is an issue that cannot be addressed in a zero-sum fashion, and that the path and pace of climate change is much more serious and much more worrisome than the science indicated just a couple of years ago. I would say, generally speaking, however, that as we head into Copenhagen, there is a fear that there is some timidity, and there's a recognition that how urgent the challenge is. But there are still countries and institutions and actors that are trying to put the brakes on overall. I am relatively hopeful, as I sit here today, that we will get a consequential program in place. And I must say, there are days and times where I lose a little heart, but I look at how far we've come in just a couple of years. I can remember a year and a half sitting at a meeting in the U.S. government in which several of the key political appointees were saying, well, look, there's really no such thing as climate change. And I think we've now, despite ClimateGate and all these other, I think there is now a broad recognition that this poses one of the greatest challenges to global stability and indeed the very life of the planet. And I do think that the United States and China are beginning to recognize the stakes at a political and strategic level, and I'm moderately hopeful that we will see progress in both societies and both political institutions.
Okay, to move to a questioner from Taipei, Ella Chow. Ella wants to know, regarding to democracy, it seems a large distance between Taiwan and China. How will both sides of the Taiwan Strait shorten that distance?
It's a very good question. First of all, I have to say the United States welcomes this process of dialogue that is taking place currently between Beijing and Taipei. Just a few years ago, just the very idea of diplomacy between the two sides almost seemed unthinkable. And so although there's a long way to go, and we're primarily focused on economic issues, I think there is a recognition that this is a very hopeful sign. I would say that in many respects that Chinese friends carefully watch the path and progress of Taiwanese democracy. And I think they see some things that they aspire to, and they probably see a few things that worry them enormously. I would say, generally speaking, that there is, in many respects, a recognition that the fullness of the Taiwanese democratic experience is not lost on either the Chinese leaders or the Chinese people, and they watch as it develops carefully. When I talk with Chinese friends about Taiwan, though, one of the things they are struck by is how divisive Taiwanese politics have become. Right. And they worry that if they move in such a direction, would they too have these enormous gulfs and difficulties in making transitions between parties? Those are hard questions, and they're difficult to answer. But overall, I've been struck. Jan's been involved in this a much longer time than I have. But just in the last 10 years, the level of discussion about democratization, concepts of democracy, local elections, issues associated with greater participation, some of those things were thought of as almost unthinkable just a short period ago. And now I hear in much more common circumstances a dialogue that just a few years ago I would have thought impossible. Right. That doesn't mean I think that this is in any way, democracy is right around the corner.
It's not a slam dunk.
Yeah. But there is an appreciation, a recognition of the role that democracy has played, not just in Taiwan, but in Japan, in South Korea, and other parts of Southeast Asia. One of the most tremendous achievements in recent years is the path and process, for instance, of democracy in Indonesia. Out of an incredibly difficult situation at the end of the 1990s, Indonesia is now one of the most vibrant and exciting democracies in all of Asia.
You just mentioned Japan, and Daniel from Weyers Cave, Virginia, asks, now that China has supplanted Japan as the dominant power in Asia, what measures, if any, should the United States adopt to counter the expansion of Chinese power and to bolster allies like Japan?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I would take issue with that overall characterization. Japan is still a prominent power in the Asian Pacific region. It plays an enormous role in multilateral institutions. It is one of the largest contributors in the United Nations. Its power and influence is felt in ways that China's is not. It is a much larger player in the United Nations. It plays a much larger role in the provision of development assistance. And its moral and political authorities and commitment to issues like denuclearization give it a certain cachet that is substantial. And with a new leadership in Japan, I think it's a very exciting time. I will tell you that the United States is determined to maintain very strong security and political alliances with the key states in Asia, with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea, with Thailand, with the Philippines, and with other states like Singapore. I will tell you that one of the most comforting and helpful developments that I've seen in recent months is that in the 1990s, a lot of debates about whether the United States was welcome in parts of Southeast Asia or whether our role was helpful. Uniformly now, in most every encounter that I, the President, Secretary Clinton, or others have in Asia, there is a broad and deep welcome of a strong and enduring American role not just economically, not just politically, but security across the board. We are going to continue to have a very strong relationship with Japan, but I would say that the idea of this sort of chessboard and that we build this relationship to counter this rise, I think that does not reflect that in many respects the challenges that we face in the Asia-Pacific region are not zero-sum, and they are not particularly susceptible to balance of power treatments.
Well, here's a question I have to take because it's from my hometown, Detroit, Michigan.
Okay.
And Saeed Khan wants to know, it's also a very interesting question, given China's proximity to South Asia and the potential of cross-border extremism, how should the United States involve China in its policies toward toward Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Well, first of all, I would say that there has been an attempt, Ambassador Holbrooke, Special Representative Holbrooke, to begin a dialogue with China about stability issues in both Afghanistan and Pakistan. I think it would be fair to say that our dialogue on North Korea and probably on Iran is a little bit more further advanced. One of the challenges that we face, I think, with Chinese friends is that an abiding belief, I think still to this day, among senior Chinese leaders is that it is best for China to follow a path of shallow engagement in global politics and to be very careful about deep engagement in any regional particular problem. And indeed, one of the only times that we've seen China venture out, play a more prominent role, has been in recent years on the so-called six-party talks with North Korea. We have yet to see a particularly active and transparent Chinese engagement in Afghanistan, although we would welcome more assistance, more commitment to a building of a stable society in Afghanistan. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, this process is going to take a much longer period of time.
Well, we really promised to spread out the questions, so at the risk of playing favorites here is another question from Detroit, but it's along those lines, from Ernestine Lyons. How real is the perceived Uyghur radical Islamic terrorist movement?
I think we've had deep but private, primarily dialogue with Chinese interlocutors about what has transpired in terms of the domestic upheavals and the violence associated with Uyghurs in a variety of cities throughout China. Chinese friends continue to characterize some of these developments as either terrorist or secessionist or violent attacks. I think the truth is much more complicated, and we've tried to underscore in our dialogues that China needs to take a much more responsible role in looking at some of the underlying problems that have contributed to tensions and violence between communities inside the country. I think the truth is that on a variety of these internal issues, China has taken a very hard line in our interactions, and we've tried to underscore both our continuing commitment to the support of democracy and human rights, but also the need to deal in a responsible way with various groups inside the country. I don't think we're under any illusions about how difficult this dialogue and this process is with Chinese friends, and it's going to continue, and we will need to have an understanding, again, that there are issues that we're going to be able to work very effectively on. There are going to be issues where we're going to disagree, and sometimes disagree vociferously.
I know one of those issues, that brings me to a question that someone asked. Jordan Nye from Boston. Just one of those issues that we totally disagree with the Chinese about. What is the U.S. doing about China not allowing U.S. groups to take North Korean refugees out of China?
Mm-hmm. I actually think this is one of the most important issues that currently we're working on. And in this respect, I must thank personally Senator Sam Brownback, who has really encouraged me to focus much more on this and to work on this. His vision is that the United States will assist much more in the relocation and the resettlement of North Korean refugees who've left China, who've left North Korea in recent years. And his model, of course, is the very generous support that the United States provided to refugees who left Southeast Asia in the wake of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the conflicts that took place in the 1960s and 1970s, where hundreds of thousands came to the United States. The number of North Korean refugees that have resettled in the United States are barely over 100, an extraordinarily small number. But the reasons for that are complicated, Jan. One is that the primary destination of choice is South Korea, and you can go to South Korea immediately. The South Korean government provides a substantial stipend and re-education efforts to try to assist North Koreans to fit in better into South Korean society. The United States, in the wake of 9/11, has a 6-month waiting process. It's very difficult to get through this. We're exploring with Senator Brownback if there are things that we can do to better assist in this process. But there are some immediate steps that I think China can assist with. They can allow the UN High Commissioner for Refugees to have greater access to some of the camps and the groups that are coming over the border. The truth is that those numbers have diminished dramatically, I think probably because of a cross-border agreement between North Korea and China. In addition, I think if we can give citizen status to North Korean women who have married Chinese citizens, if they can have the rights at least of the Chinese state, and that their offspring are also given those rights, that at least give us a benchmark for how to proceed in certain circumstances. But the truth is, we have not done enough to support this effort. This is a tragedy, and the number of people who have fled North Korea is still quite alarming, and it reflects a deeply problematic set of circumstances inside of North Korea. So this question is actually right on. In the United States, we need to do more, not just as a government, but also non-government organizations, institutions, and churches need to step up to meet this very real human challenge.
Here's a question that I know is near and dear to your heart, and we didn't plant this. It's from Richard Bodman in Northfield, Minnesota, who actually is someone who does some work for us escorting Fulbright delegations to China every summer. And Richard wants to ask you to please say something about the present and future of U.S.-China educational exchanges.
Thank you. And Jan is right about this. One of the things that we worked on, and we were frankly quite disappointed, got remarkably little attention. I have pretty much an unerring ability to get this wrong. I thought this would be a very big deal, and it hardly even merited a mention. But we have set up a program that over the next 4 years we're going to increase and see to it that 100,000 American students have the chance to study in China. And we're going to do that through a variety of programs and support to existing groups and institutions, and we're just very excited about this. And we think that what better way to send a message to China that the United States is interested in working with it than sending your young people. That's just the best possible example. And what we've seen is a substantial increase in recent years, but we think steps can be taken to be able to increase that number rather substantially, and we're engaged in that now. We want all levels of education exchange of Americans to go to China. High school students for a period of time, 3 to 4 month programs where they at least get an initial exposure to the Chinese language, undergraduates for a year or a long semester, and graduate work over a sustained period to study some specific issues on China that would be important. We think such an initiative could have a lasting and important contribution to U.S.-China relations. And I must tell you, one of the things that inspired me on this was a story that was told to me by a woman named Jan Barris about her early experience going to China and how it changed her life. We want to do that to a number of young people who will be attracted to this incredible drama that's playing out before us and play a role in one of the most consequential bilateral relationships in history.
Speaking of young people, Nell from Weyers Cave, Virginia, wants to know what role young people under 40, that leaves you and me out,
Yeah, we're out.
are playing in increasing understanding between the United States and China.
Well, what's interesting is, President Obama had a chance to have a town hall meeting when he was in Shanghai, and it was a complicated deal, all the negotiations. And I must say that I think some Chinese friends were still anxious in the government about, whether, the president should be allowed a completely unfiltered engagement with the Chinese people. We believe that a very large percentage, a very large number of people had a chance to look at what he said either online or directly, probably 70 or 80 million people in the final analysis. But what I was struck by was how sophisticated the questions were from Chinese young people. I come from an academic background, and I see on a daily basis the level of interest and focus and a recognition that really it is going to be up to the next generation, that we're seeing this tremendous change of the guard, if you will. I was at a dinner not long ago in which Henry Kissinger and Brent Scowcroft and Sandy Berger, all these wonderful men and women who helped define U.S.-China relations over the course of the last generation. But the truth is now it's time to pass the baton to a new generation. And we're hoping that through this education initiatives and a variety of other things, that these younger people will be prepared and will want to step up and take the relationship to the next level.
Chung Gong in Dayton, Ohio, wants to know whether you feel Chinese manufacturing decreases jobs in the United States.
The issue of trade is one of the most challenging and difficult issues confronting the United States and our manufacturing situation is clearly at the top of the list politically. It is undeniably the case that if you look at the recent job numbers, that the United States continues to lose jobs in manufacturing globally. And I think that process has been underway now for decades. But it has clearly intensified in recent years. Those who support free and open trade, and I'm among that group, recognizes that while overall there can be profound and deep benefits, that in the short term there can be deep challenges to specific pockets, and clearly we've seen those very significant disruptions in manufacturing and a variety of other textile and other areas of work. I believe that the United States has to take some specific steps, both in terms of education, refocusing some of our manufacturing base. I think the president is absolutely correct when he talks about the prospect and potential of green jobs. I think this transition is going to be difficult. It's not going to take, a couple of years. It will likely take decades. The United States still can compete and will compete globally in manufacturing, but we need to recognize that the nature of the challenge that we face from Asia and elsewhere is severe. Government's going to have to take some specific steps. I think it will do so in a way that will keep American markets open and keep our engagement with Asia strong. But as the president said time and time again as he went through Asia, that the current situation in the United States is untenable. 10% unemployment, enormous pressure to create jobs, to build a stronger economic foundation that leads to greater employment. And that in that environment, Asian friends need to understand that they need to do more to assist, frankly, in absorbing many exports coming from the United States.
Okay, Kurt, we have 5 minutes left.
Okay.
We've got lots of interesting questions
sorry,
here on the table.
I'm answering too long.
No, your answers are
These
fabulous.
These are hard questions,
They're
though.
tough questions. I'm really impressed with these, and I've got 3 tough ones in front of me that I'm going to read you all because they...
So I can ignore which one I want.
You can ignore, but they have a common theme.
Okay.
And hopefully you'll answer it within the now 4 3/4, because we still have more. From Anonymous in Boston, with all the talk of establishing democracy in China, will you take into consideration the devastating or the destabilizing effect that might have in China? From Anonymous in Sarasota, If the president cannot demand improvement in human rights, which you started off saying, what is the administration doing to achieve such improvements? And from Christine Towney in Ocala, Florida, do you think China's handling of Tibet reflects American values?
First of all, let me just say that there are a number of ways a country can go about promoting democracy and human rights. I think the president has tried to take some very clear steps at home that send a very clear message about those issues and are reflected in his determination, for instance, to close Guantanamo, as difficult as that may be. I have to say, quite honestly, though, as I travel through Asia and I watch the look on our interlocutors' face when they interact with the president, there is a sense of almost amazement that a country with a very deep and divided history of racial relations has elected a president like Barack Obama. That's the first level. And I actually think that the very example of that has a powerful force in our diplomacy. But it doesn't end there. I will tell you where I also see it on a daily basis. It's not easy to forget that one of the most difficult, hard-fought political periods in modern history was the fight between President Obama and between then Senator Obama and Senator Clinton. Bitter, divisive, and extraordinarily damaging to the Democratic Party. And when the president decided that he would reach out and ask Secretary Clinton to serve as his Secretary of State, and when she decided to do so and has served him very ably and with total loyalty, I must say that I see the message that that sends in a variety of countries where people find it difficult to lose and deal with their counterparts, not necessarily in China, but in all of Southeast Asia. And so not only do we raise human rights and democracy, despite its imperfections and the challenges that they possess in all of our interactions with our Chinese friends, and they come to, and they expect it, and we work through the issues from the situation with the Uyghurs to Tibet and Taiwan. Not only do we raise these issues on a sustained basis, we also believe that it is also the conduct of our own government and the election of the president and his choice as Secretary of State, that those examples actually set a context for our engagement that is quite helpful. Will these issues be challenging going forward? Absolutely. But ultimately, these decisions will be for the Chinese people, and our role is to provide the best possible example and encouragement along the way.
That was a terrific answer, and I am sort of thinking I should end on that because we have 1 minute left, but let me just try one other, and it gives you a chance to do a little advertising for the team. It's from Colin Smith in Northfield, Minnesota.
Yeah.
It harkens back to something we said at the beginning. Many people in the United States have been critical of President Obama's recent trip to Asia. In your opinion, how do you think he did? You can give me a 1 to 10, or you have 30 seconds to give me a good one.
I have never worked with a person who is more disciplined, who knows the issues better, who is committed to Asia, and who works at it very hard than President Obama. And I have to tell you, isn't a day that goes by, despite all the challenges, that I am not unbelievably grateful for the chance to serve both Secretary Clinton and President Obama. And I just think they're two fantastic people, and it's just an honor to work with them. And I would give them both very high grades in the most difficult possible political environment.
Well, and I want to give you very high grades, not only for tonight, but all the work you're doing. I know it's challenging, it's tough. I asked you before if you were having fun, and you said yes.
Yeah. I have not had one day that I have had any second thoughts or doubts. Every day has been fantastic.
Well, and as all the kind words that you've said about them, I'm sure if we had the two of them here, they'd say the same about you. And I'm sure all the people out there watching you tonight also feel the same. And we want to thank you so much for helping us out.
Thank you very much.
Great.
I think Kurt did kind of set the scene talking about the rise of China. It is obviously very strongly economically based. Their very strong 3 decades of economic growth has propelled them to their current position where we can talk about them as a rising power. The key themes I want to emphasize tonight are that China's economic rise is on track despite the global financial and economic crisis. I think China was the first globally significant economy to come off the bottom. They're now in a very strong recovery. They're not growing quite as fast as they were 2 years ago, but relative to the rest of the world, their performance has been quite stellar. I think also China has the potential to come back to or converge back towards its long-term potential growth rate in advance of most of the rest of the world, certainly in advance of the United States and other high-income industrial economies. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about additional steps they need to take on the reform front to move ahead on their agenda and to make sure that that resumption of growth is more in the 9 to 10% range where it has been for so long, rather than at a lower pace that might eventuate if they don't take those kinds of steps. But let me begin. I'm going to put up some very simple diagrams demonstrating a few of the things that I'm talking about. The first one, obviously, is to demonstrate the recovery that is underway in China. China's begun to release quarter-over-quarter growth, which is what I want you to focus on, the pink line here, which shows really China bottomed out in terms of its economic growth. The slow point, the lowest quarter, was the fourth quarter of last year. They began to recover in the first quarter, growing at about 4 to 5%. In the second quarter, growing at almost 15%, and about 9% quarter over quarter in the third quarter of this year. So now we're in the fourth quarter. China is in the fourth quarter of a very strong recovery that's going to lead to at least 8% growth this year and possibly something closer to 9% next year. Obviously, the United States has not yet begun a recovery. Some European countries have begun to recover a little bit, but this is far and away the strongest growth performance of any country on the globe, and it's basically a response to the government's policies and some of the structural factors that advantage China in the current situation. I'm not going to talk a great deal about the government response because I think we've all read about the stimulus package, the monetary expansion, the infrastructure, and so forth. What I want to do is to talk a bit about the criticisms that have been leveled at China's recovery program, their stimulus program, and say that I think that they have been overblown, exaggerated, and I think China's strong growth basically is going to prove to be sustainable. So what I'd just like to do is run through some of these criticisms. Certainly one of them is that it's all government investment. You're throwing a lot of money at the problem, the government's investing a lot of money, but eventually government investment program will have to taper off, and when that happens, growth will slacken. And in the interim, China's growth, of course, according to the critics, has become more imbalanced because the investment rate has remained elevated. The reality is actually somewhat more promising than that. Consumption growth in China this year has been extremely strong. Indeed, this is a diagram that shows the rate of growth of consumption in the first 3 months of this year in all emerging market economies that provide this kind of data. It's a fairly big sample, and as you can see, China's way over there on the left, growing at around 8 to 9% in terms of underlying consumption. The story is the same thing in the second quarter. China's consumption, if anything, has picked up slightly, far and away the strongest growth of consumption. This is in part based on some significant growth of incomes in China that has occurred, which is a reflection of the strong recovery. But it's also based in part on an acceleration or pickup in household borrowing. In other words, people are spending more because their incomes are growing, and they're also borrowing to finance expenditures, both consumption expenditures and I'll say a minute later, some investment expenditures as well. If you look at this diagram, you see that the slope of the lines has increased substantially in 2009, which means the increase in borrowing by households is substantially greater this year than it was last year. And this really points out one of the most remarkable differences between China, let's say, and the United States, or the UK, Spain, Ireland, and so forth. And that is, China's households don't have very much debt. So the way I put it is that China's growth this year has had a substantial portion of it based on an acceleration of consumption. And we could say that China is a re-leveraging story. Households are taking on more debt to expand their consumption. And what we've seen in the United States is exactly the opposite. The data just came out the other day, yesterday, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, that credit outstanding to households has now been declining in the United States for 9 consecutive months. And the decline in household consumption is dragging down our economic growth because consumption is a very large share of total aggregate demand. China's the opposite situation. People are borrowing more to finance additional expenditures, and that is contributing to the very strong economic growth. Now, you might think, why should they follow our example? We didn't turn out so well. But just to put it in perspective, this is where China and the United States and the United Kingdom were on kind of the eve of the financial crisis, how much debt people had relative to their disposable income, which is just after-tax income. And as you can see, the United States up at around 130%, the UK up at around 150%, and Chinese households had relatively little debt, about a third of their disposable income. So they are in a position for a period of time they can increase their borrowing in order to finance more expenditures and contribute to the growth of their economy. In addition, so the first criticism, or the first counter to the criticisms that China's recovery is all based on government investment is, well, there's a very substantial portion that's coming from consumption. In addition, there is a portion that is coming from private investment, not government investment. And private investment here, I'm talking about real estate, which is overwhelmingly private. And Chinese leaders in 2007 came to the view that their property market was getting a little frothy, a little inflated. It might be approaching a bubble. And as you can see in this diagram, in most of the months in 2007 and continuing in the early part of 2008, the growth of investment in real estate was running 25–30% growth in every month. And unlike Alan Greenspan, who said he couldn't identify a bubble even if he saw it, and if he saw it and someone told him it was a bubble, he wouldn't know what to do about it, and he'd rather clean up the mess afterwards and try to let the air out because that was too risky. The Chinese put some brakes on real estate investment at the beginning, at the tail end of 2007 and continuing through 2008. They raised the down payment requirements, they raised the interest rates a number of times, and took a number of other steps. And as you can see, it worked pretty well. Throughout 2008, you had a slowdown in real estate investment. Prices softened a little bit. The froth came out of the market. But then when the global crisis hit and China decided they needed a little bit more aggregate demand, at the tail end of last year, just about a year ago, they reversed some of those steps, and they made it easier to get mortgage loans. They reduced the interest rates and so forth, and they've gradually built the real estate market back up. Prices are beginning to rise, but it's not a bubble yet. On average, in September, for example, house prices were about 3% higher than they had been in September of 2008. And you can see here we've had a recovery of the growth of real estate investment. It's now growing 15–20% per year on a month-by-month basis, but we're not up to the 25–30% that we had back in 2007. So there has been a recovery of private investment in housing, and that's the second example that shows that China's recovery is not all based on government investment. Now, there's a third dimension that I want to also point out that also suggests that this government investment story that we read about in the press all the time has been somewhat exaggerated. And that is that the government expenditures that we've seen this year and really starting a couple of years ago have had a very, very large place for social expenditures, education, health, and pensions. This shows how much those expenditures have increased since 2003, and maybe the diagram's a little bit complicated, but basically the story here is that starting in 2006, we had a very substantial acceleration of the growth of government expenditures. This was, remember, the period in which they were eliminating school fees in the countryside over a several-year period. This is a period in which they're beginning to dramatically expand the provision of health insurance, even in the countryside, through a rural cooperative health care scheme, and other pension payments in China for those people who are currently retired. They were increased by 10% at the beginning of 2008, 10% at the beginning of 2009, and they will be increased an additional 10% on January 1st, 2010. So this is a very substantial increase, way in excess of inflation, very substantial increase in pension payments. Just to give you a little bit more detail, if you just focus on health, Chinese government health expenditures in 2008 were 2 times what they were in 2006. There's no other country in the world that has doubled their health expenditure in a 2-year period. This reflects the dramatic expansion in the health insurance programs that I've already mentioned. These consumption expenditures on the part of the government are very important because they are diversifying the sources of demand. It's not just investment. We also have some social programs. And they're also important because the high savings rate in Chinese households is in part precautionary. People are uncertain about whether they'll get health care, whether they'll be able to afford to send their kids to school, and so forth. If the government provides those programs on a more sustainable basis, then the precautionary demand for savings could come down, and people would consume more, and China would rebalance its economic growth. Assistant Secretary Campbell alluded to this when he talked about the rebalancing agenda. That's a key portion of the economic dimension of the bilateral relationship between China and the United States. So the first point I want to make, and have made, I hope, is that the recovery program is not just government investment. There's a substantial role for private consumption, there's a substantial role for private investment, and there's also a substantial role for government social expenditures of the type that I've just been discussing. Now, a second criticism that you read about in the press all the time is that the government investment is heavily weighted towards manufacturing, that China already has excess capacity. They're creating even more excess capacity, that they're going to go back to exporting their way to high growth, and that this will be problematic in terms of China's trade relations with the rest of the world. It will also perhaps be deflationary in China. If you have a lot of excess capacity, then prices tend to fall. It could become hard for companies to repay their loans as their earnings decline. Well, China certainly does have excess capacity, but I don't think it's being substantially exacerbated in China's stimulus program. The stimulus program is primarily monetary. That is the expansion of lending by various banks, which are more or less controlled one way or another by the government, rather than through budgetary expenditures. And this is a diagram which looks at the composition of medium and long-term loans. In other words, any loan for a term of more than a year. These are the kinds of loans that are used to finance investment as opposed to shorter-term loans which finance working capital. And one of the key takeaways here is that investment in manufacturing, the blue line, only accounts for about 10% of the expansion of credit by the banking system in the first 3 quarters of this year, and it's really barely increased from previous years when it was running typically 9.5%. The lion's share of the investment of medium and long-term, the lion's share of the medium and long-term lending by banks is going to infrastructure programs. This is massive expansions of urban transportation systems, subway systems, water treatment systems, high-speed intercity trains, and so forth. And I think in general, I would argue that the return on these kinds of investments is likely to be fairly high. China is still a rapidly urbanizing society. The demand for infrastructure is quite substantial. Another couple 100 million people are going to move into the cities over the next 10 years or so. The demand for the services that this infrastructure supplies will be quite substantial. And I think the real economic return to these kinds of investment will be very high. If you listen to Barack Obama's speech today in Washington talking about more infrastructure expenditure coming in the US, he made a similar kind of argument for the United States. I think it applies much more to China, where only half the people live in cities now, roughly, and urbanization will accelerate and continue to grow over the next couple of decades. So I'm basically skeptical of the view that China's massively misallocating resources, putting money into manufacturing. I would argue rather that investment in manufacturing this year has probably actually declined, because most investment in China in manufacturing is financed with retained earnings, and particularly in the early part of the year when the economy was growing very slowly, companies' profits were lower than they had been in earlier periods. There's been some recovery in the last couple of quarters, but profits are still much lower this year than they were last year, particularly in the first half. So the combination of reduced profits and not a large share of lending suggests that manufacturing investment has not been a big driver of China's recovery. It's the substantial increase in loans that are going to infrastructure investment of the type that I've just been describing. The third critique that I want to take up briefly is this argument that, again, you read it quite frequently, is that lending growth in China has been so massive, the increase in credit has been so large that it has created excess liquidity, which eventually will lead to high inflation and lots of dislocation as a result. And it is true that in the first half of this year, this shows us the month-on-month increase in loans outstanding starting at the beginning of 2008. And you can see in 2008, typically loans are going up by 300, 400 billion RMB per month. But starting when the stimulus program was announced in the fall of last year, we had many months of over 600, 700, 800 billion RMB, and a couple of months that were well over, I guess 3 months that were well over 1 trillion RMB. So there's been a massive increase in lending. But if you look at the diagram, you will see that this has begun to taper off. The last 4 months are much, much lower. So that although China's headline policy continues to be exactly the same, they had a Central Economic Work Conference in Beijing that concluded, I think, on Monday this week, and the headline policy is the same as it has been for a year, and they're describing it as moderately loose monetary policy. But underneath that, there have been some adjustments. Credit growth is beginning to slow down to a more sustainable level. And if that continues, I think China will avoid most of the inflation problems that people have anticipated. It is true China has a big problem. It has the same problem every other country in the world has today, and that is what you read about in the newspaper, especially if you look at the financial press every day. It's the so-called exit problem. When should the government start to withdraw the support that has led to the beginning of recoveries in a lot of economies, and hopefully will lead to recoveries even more? So, you know, in the US, it's the repaying of those funds that the various financial institutions borrowed. And most, you know, how soon should the Fed start raising interest rates above the extremely low levels that have prevailed now for more than a year? China has the same exit problem. And I think it is beginning to deal with it, and the lending growth has slowed down. And if that continues as we move into 2010, I think this problem is going to be manageable, a challenge but manageable. So my conclusion is basically that China's stimulus program has been quite successful. We saw it in the first diagram. Growth has recovered relatively early compared to many other countries, relatively rapidly. And if you look in the details about the charges that have been leveled against China's stimulus program, that it's all investment, that they're creating a lot of excess capacity in manufacturing, that credit growth is so rapid it's going to lead to an inflationary blowout. You can't eliminate some of those possibilities, but I think in general these criticisms are somewhat exaggerated. Well, let me turn next to this question of the rebalancing challenge that Kurt Campbell mentioned or alluded to in the answer to one of the early questions that he took. And this is really a very important issue because it is going to determine the success China has at this. I believe will determine whether their growth can continue at a very high rate of the type we've seen in the past, the 9 to 10% range, or whether their future growth will be somewhat more modest. And this year is somewhat encouraging. The imbalances that have emerged in the Chinese economy over the last 5 or 6 years seem to be much, much smaller. For example, if you look at the external side, China in the middle part of this decade became a massive surplus country, selling far more exports to the rest of the world than it purchased in imports. So it had a huge trade surplus, indeed the largest trade surplus on record for any significant economy, as measured by the current account, which includes a few other items besides trade. China's surplus by 2007 was 11% of GDP. Those of you who may remember back in the period when the United States was criticizing Japan back in the mid-1980s, when they had a big trade surplus, led to a lot of trade friction with the United States. At its peak, Japan's current account surplus was 3.4% of GDP. So China's surplus, relative to the size of its economy, was 3 times bigger than this big Japanese surplus of a couple of decades ago. But the surplus is declining dramatically. This year, I expect the current account surplus will be about half of what it was in 2007. China's exports are down this year much more than its imports, which means that this external imbalance. In terms of the internal side, I think I've already given you part of the answer. There's beginning to be a rebalancing of the economy on the internal side as well, because consumption is making a bigger contribution to economic growth than it has in the past. This is the first year, and the first 3 quarters of this year is the first time that consumption growth has been more rapid than GDP growth. So consumption's playing a larger role in generating economic growth. The question really is whether or not these trends are sustainable over time. On the external side, I believe it's likely that China's surplus will tend to grow as we move through 2010 for several reasons. First of all, we'll see more recovery in the United States and Europe. That will increase imports in those countries, which will mean an increase in China's exports. So we could get a reversal of the situation that we've seen so far this year when their exports are down much more than their imports. That's partly because China's recovered earlier, and as their economy begins to grow more rapidly, or has begun to grow more rapidly compared to the rest of the world, their demand is rising, and that sucks in imports. But demand in the United States and most other advanced industrial economies is still very anemic, so China's exports are down much more than their imports. That could reverse as we get more general global recovery. China also had a lot of commodity speculation in the first part of the year. Commodity prices were very depressed by recent standards, and a lot of Chinese trading companies imported massive amounts of commodities, things like iron ore, copper, and so forth. Those copper imports in the first 7 months were something like 130% greater than they had been in the same period of 2008. So they built up big stockpiles, and now those are beginning, imports of commodities are beginning to taper off. So the external imbalance might get bigger next year. Internally, I think the big challenge for China is still to generate more rapid growth of personal income, of disposable income, of wages, if you will. And I think that is essential, because you cannot, as we've seen from the lesson of the United States, you can't build you can't build consumption growth over the long term by borrowing more and more money. We basically had a debt-driven consumption boom in the United States, but it can't last, because eventually debt levels get too high, as we saw in the US. China wants to avoid that, so they need to move towards a more consumption-driven growth path, but a consumption-driven growth that is based on the growth of income, not the growth of borrowing and debt. And I think this is not likely to occur until 2 things happen. First, their currency needs to appreciate significantly from where it is today. That's very important, because the undervalued currency in China, if you're selling $1's worth of exports into the international market with an undervalued currency, you get back more domestic currency when you convert back into RMB, and that means activities that involve exports or competing with imports are more profitable than they would be if the exchange rate was not undervalued. So essentially what an undervalued exchange rate does is it tilts investment into the manufacturing sector, and that's what's happened in China over the last 5 years. And how does that relate to this consumption rebalancing story? Well, it's very simple. The manufacturing sector, on average, is much more capital intensive than the services sector, and so as you tilt investment into manufacturing, you create fewer jobs and you have slower wage growth, and that combination is certain. That combination basically has produced what we've seen in China over the last 5 to 7 years, and which has been a decline in the wage share of GDP. So the first thing China needs to do is to have some significant appreciation of its currency so that services and manufacturing on a more level playing field. That would lead to more investment in services, more job creation, more growth of wages, and that would form the basis for more sustained growth in consumption. A related reform that's needed is to reform the prices of factor inputs. I've argued for years that China is a very market-driven economy in labor markets and product markets and so forth. But there are certain things the government still controls the price, and energy is probably the best example. Energy prices, whether you're talking about fuels like gasoline and diesel fuel or electricity, is significantly underpriced. The power generating companies get subsidized so that they can sell their output at less than the cost of the fuels that go into generating the electricity. And in China, most electricity is used in manufacturing. Households, in the cities you see glitzy buildings that seem to, they have air conditioning and all kinds of other things, but you get out to the countryside, most people are living in a house that has one light bulb, and maybe if they're very prosperous, they might have a TV or a refrigerator. But the result is that the vast majority of electricity in China is actually used in manufacturing rather than in households. It's a very different structure of demand than we see in the United States. So when you have an underpriced resource like electricity, it's a subsidy to the manufacturing sector, which again, like an undervalued currency, tends to increase the profitability in manufacturing. And in this respect, China is a market economy. If you distort prices like the exchange rate and inputs like energy, you will, I guarantee, what we've seen in the last 5 years is that investment goes into those sectors. Entrepreneurs, businesses expand manufacturing, and that, as I said, leads to lower wage growth and lower growth of employment. So internally, I think there's still more reform is needed in terms of pricing, both of foreign exchange and of certain key inputs like electricity and fuels. If China moves strongly in those directions, I think it has the potential to get its investment internally reallocated more towards the service sector, generate more jobs, more growth of wages, which generates more disposable income, which can be the basis for more consumption-driven growth, which is the rebalancing that Secretary Campbell was referring to in his remarks. So China's, I think, recovery is very strong. It's driven by a very, very, I think, very, very well-designed stimulus program. It's not just investment. There's a consumption component. I didn't mention a lot of the consumption has been driven by reductions in taxes, for example, on automobiles, consumer durables, which has given people an extra incentive to go out and buy these things. They've been willing to take on more debt to do that. China has also been assisted, quite frankly, by the fact that its financial structure left it relatively unaffected by the global financial crisis. They don't need to deleverage. The households don't have much debt. The corporate sector does not have a lot of debt. The government itself does not have a lot of debt compared to, say, for example, the United States. So the combination of a well-designed stimulus program and certain structural features of their economy have led to this relatively strong recovery. So I think China can easily do the 8 to 9% growth, but getting back up to the 9-10% range as they have had over the past decade or so, I think will require more domestic economic reform. And the reason is very straightforward. They cannot rely on the United States to continue to be the consumer of last resort, because consumption growth in the United States, I think, is going to be, obviously, compared to the recent past, will be somewhat anemic for a number of years. So they need to generate more domestic demand from consumption rather than exports. If they can succeed at doing that, I think they'll continue on their relatively strong growth path. If they don't, they'll have to accept a somewhat slower growth than they've seen over the past 3 decades. Well, let me stop there and take questions if you have them.
Yeah, I wonder, why do we continue to let China manipulate its currency for many, many years, which results in United States products to China being up to 40% more costly, and their exports to us 40% cheaper. And this has been going on for quite a few years. How much longer are we going to allow them to manipulate the currency?
Well, the basic problem, quite frankly, is that we don't have very many policy instruments to get them to change their currency value. We do not, you can't put on tariffs. Let's say I've already said I agree with you, their currency's undervalued. Let's say it's by 10% or whatever number we think it is. We could offset that by a 10% tariff. That's what Nixon did back in 1971. He said all these, Japan and Europe, all these currencies are undervalued, and he said they need to be market determined and to float, and he put on 10% tariffs, and within a matter of months, all those countries allowed their currencies to float. That was possible in 1970 or 71 when he did it. It's not legal anymore because we constrained what we would do, and other countries have constrained what they will do in this organization called the World Trade Organization. So we cannot just kind of unilaterally put on tariffs because we think somebody's currency is not appropriate or is undervalued. So our ability to get other countries to move their currencies is quite limited. We've seen it over the years. In the case of Japan, we finally got them to move a little bit. China's currency has been undervalued, and I think continues to be undervalued even though their external surplus is getting smaller. But we send our Treasury secretaries over to talk about this issue, but we don't have very many concrete levers. And some members of Congress have tried to design bills that would give us more leverage and still be consistent with our international obligations. But that hasn't worked. So really the alternative is to, kind of resign from the WTO. You can decide you're not going to be a member anymore, and then you could do whatever you want on tariffs. But most people think that would be shooting ourselves in the foot, that we'd be giving up, there'd be retaliation, and we'd be in a downward spiral in terms of global trade. So I think the reality is we don't have a lot of leverage. In my own, I've been writing about this for the last 5 or 6 years, and I think the argument at the end of the day that it will cause China to change its policy is a better understanding of these domestic factors that I think make a really compelling case for allowing their currency to appreciate. But they don't like to respond to international pressure.
Joe Miao from the Detroit Chinese Business Association. I have a question for you regarding inflation. You mentioned briefly China might be able to avoid inflation problems, which face many countries who put down a lot of money. But news broke out several weeks ago in China. There was a sudden price increase of garlic, pepper, cooking oil, rice. So do you expect that price increase would spread to other commodities or consumer products?
Well, it is interesting. The garlic and certain products have shot up in price, and some people are attributing this to the rapid growth of the money supply and so forth. I think what we're going to see in China, as you know, China's leadership historically has been, in the entire period since 1949, has been very sensitive to inflation. And whenever inflation starts rising, we see very substantial reaction on the part of the government, tightening up monetary policy, raising interest rates, and so forth. Now, they are somewhat constrained because with their currency undervalued and probably eventually going to appreciate, if they raise their interest rates too high, then they will attract some capital inflow, which makes it harder for them to keep their currency undervalued. So there is a bit of a trade-off. But I think China has a lot of headroom. They reduced reserve requirements quite a few times in 2007 and early 2008 as part of their monetary tightening. They could reverse those steps without having a big effect on the interest rate. So I think they will be very, very, very vigilant on inflation. I think the consumer price index will be back into positive territory before the end of the year, but I don't think it's going to go above, 3 or possibly 4 percentage points as we move through next year.
A while ago, almost 1.5 years ago, around 2007, Chinese government temporarily allowed the currency appreciate little, which caused over 10,000 businesses going bankrupt around the Zhujiang Delta area. So I guess my question is, how can you persuade the Chinese government, hey, if you allow RMB to appreciate, which won't cause a lot of factories going bankrupt? Thank you.
Well, I think this is the classic political problem. You have to accept some short-term pain in order to get long-term gain. Once you have a big manufacturing establishment because you have distorted prices that make manufacturing more profitable, then if you want to rebalance in order to get more growth in the services sector, inevitably some of those manufacturing firms will turn out will no longer be profitable, and they'll lose employment, and some of them will shut down. And I can make a kind of theoretical argument that the new jobs you're going to create in services sector will be many times more than you're going to lose from closing down or the bankruptcy of some of the manufacturing establishments. But politicians don't like to accept short-term gains, short-term pain for long-term gain. And I think it's the same problem in China. The argument that the Chinese make for the so-called stability of their currency is basically one of employment. But I think the argument is very, very short-term in nature. The growth of employment in China has slowed dramatically in this decade compared to the 1990s. In the 1990s, China did not have an undervalued currency. The service sector was expanding as a share of GDP. The growth of wages was much more robust, and disposable income as a share of GDP was more stable and going down only slightly. In this decade, it's been falling like a rock. So I think the long-term evidence is quite clear. If you overinvest in manufacturing and underinvest in services, you're going to get slower job creation and slower growth of wages, and the consumption share of GDP is going to go down. But the problem is, once you've had 5, 6, 7 years of overinvestment in manufacturing, you are going to have to accept some short-term pain to get on to the more sustainable, more productive growth path. So that does make it extremely difficult. Especially if you're a Hu Jintao, Wen Jiabao, you've got 2 or 3 years left on your term. Why are you going to undertake some structural change that is going to be costly in the short run? They're going to try to postpone it.
Do you think that China's increasing recognition of the dangers of climate change will lead them to increase the price of energy and fossil fuels in their economy?
Do I think the Chinese are?
They're becoming more aware of global climate change.
Oh, yes.
Global warming.
Okay. Well, I think there's really been a sea change in Chinese attitudes on global warming. They've studied the problem very intensively. They now understand the scientific evidence of supporting the idea of global warming, and they've also done some fairly thorough research on exactly how it will affect China. If the sea rises, how much of coastal China is going to be underwater, what percentage of their GDP is going to be erased, what percentage of the population they'll have to resettle. And that's why in the current 5-year plan, they adopted this target of reducing energy intensity. This is not a target to reduce the amount of energy used absolutely, but to reduce the amount of energy used per unit of GDP. And the goal was 20%, and I think they're going to, the last year of the 5-year plan is next year. I think they're going to come close, maybe not quite. They'll probably get 17, 18% at least reduction in energy intensity in the 5-year plan. And Hu Jintao announced, I guess now about 2 weeks ago or 10 days ago, that by 2020, they would reduce greenhouse gas emissions between 40 and 45% per unit of GDP. So that's a continuation of the same energy intensity approach. but it's now been expanded, it's now been converted basically into greenhouse gas emissions rather than just pure energy. And I think it's a fairly aggressive target. Some people have dismissed it, saying, well, they did 20% in the last 5 years. Why can't they do more than 20% in each of the next 2 5-year periods? But I think they've already taken out a lot of what we would call the low-hanging fruit, and it will be increasingly difficult and challenging for them to meet this new goal. They have very aggressive targets on the expansion of renewables, certainly the most aggressive of any country in the world in terms of what they're hoping to achieve in terms of wind and solar power generation. And I think there's a big push on green technology in general, and I think there's a chance China will end up being a major player, if not the major player in this space.
On the consumption, the recent consumption increase, the reason for that, from what you said, is the stimulus, right? Debt finance, sort of cheaper credit, more household borrowing, and also tax reductions on cars and things like that. But structurally, your argument is that they're still in an underconsumption because of the overinvestment in manufacturing. Isn't it true that a big chunk of the high savings, which is the other side of the story of low consumption in China, occurs in the corporate sector?
Right.
What, other than the undervalued currency, what are the reasons why there's such a high savings rate in the corporate sector? And isn't one way to get rid of that to raise wages? Which, of course, there's no necessary incentive to do so, except insofar as part of the corporate sector is state-owned and could actually do that. And if you did that, you would increase consumption, et cetera,
right,
reduce exports, et cetera.
Well, I agree with the information that you cited. It is true that a very large share of the increase in savings that has occurred in China over this decade is because of an increase in corporate savings. But again, most of that has been generated in the manufacturing sector. Profits in manufacturing back in 2002, 2003 were about 5% of GDP. By 2007, they were about 12% of GDP. So we've had a massive increase. Corporate profits is roughly equal to retained earnings, which is roughly equal to corporate savings. Now, the question is, what do you do about this? Well, I've already suggested one thing you do is to have a more reasonable exchange rate, because you artificially have boosted up profits in that sector through having an undervalued currency. So the first policy tool would be, quit intervening in the foreign exchange market and building up these massive foreign exchange reserves, which keep the currency undervalued. You say one other possibility would be to raise wages, but again, I go back to what I said before. China's basically a market economy, particularly in labor markets. I think the wages in China are pretty much determined by a labor market, and the government can't just dictate higher wages. There are, however, a couple of other possibilities. One is dividends. These corporates, some of them are listed, many of them are not. The ones that are listed should pay higher dividends to their shareholders. They tried to implement this kind of a reform over the last 3 or 4 years, and so far it has failed. The amount of money that's being collected in the dividend tax is trivially small. But eventually, I think one solution is to list more of the companies and have the companies pay more dividends to shareholders. Because one of the reasons that household disposable income has gone down, it's not just that wages have not gone up fast enough, but also what is referred to as property income, which in China means basically dividends and interest income, have declined dramatically over this decade. Even though people save a lot more, they have a lot more money in the bank, but the real interest rate has gone down, and the amount of money that shareholders get from dividend payments because they own some shares of companies listed on the Shanghai Stock Exchange is very low. So eventually, reforms in those areas could lead to more growth of disposable income, higher dividends. That's another thing China needs to do, is financial liberalization, so that households are not implicitly taxed by the very low rate of return that they get on their savings and bank deposits. But I don't think raising wages is really feasible given the market oriented labor markets that they now have.